Sorry, I had some technical issues this morning, so it took me a moment to get on here.
No worries.
So I have a new dog. I didn't plan on it. And that's why we've only had him since Sunday, but he's actually fitting in really well. And you will hear him bark during the class. I'm 99% sure of it.
What kind of dog is it?
He is a German Shepherd Lab mix.
Oh, so you're joining the German Shepherd Club like me.
Well, you know what? I've had them before. I grew up with them.
We love German Shepherds.
We love German Shepherds, my mother says.
Yes, we're growing very attached to ours.
Yeah.
Although he's at the vet and he's probably 40 pounds at 17 weeks.
This one is about Mom, how big do you think he is? He's about 50. He's smaller. Which is not a bad thing.
No.
He's 8 months and he's about 50 pounds.
Aw.
But now he's flopping on the floor. I kept trying to get him over here so that he would introduce himself. And now he's flopping on the floor, so you're not going to be able to see him.
What's his
He's
name?
right here. Louis. He
Louis,
came with
oh.
that name. He came with that name, and it was kind of a sad situation in that they were either going to have to give him to a shelter or find someone who would take him. And when we were able to take on dogs because of our fortunate circumstances, we don't ever have to give them up. The big dog, Ruby, is actually going to leave. And that's because technically she's never been ours. The owner of her, who was our neighbor, died 2 weeks ago.
I'm so
And
sorry.
yeah, I mean, it was kind of a long time coming because we've been watching her since he went into long-term care since November, right before Thanksgiving. And so she's leaving when the family gets ready. They have a plan set up for her. And she'll be happier there. But I was kind of sad that she was leaving. And my mom ran into some people who were trying to desperately find a home for this dog before they had to take it to the shelter because the owner was homeless and was trying to do the right thing by his dog. And it may be temporary in that I've already offered, it was a emotional support dog that he couldn't afford to get registered. So I've already offered to pay for it if he finds a place where he thinks that he can take his dog back. I'll pay for the registration for the emotional support dog. But until then, he's ours. And he actually, I mean, I'm amazed how quickly he's fitted in. But just so you know, if you hear this big dog barking, that's him.
All right.
Because he's got quite the ferocious bark. Yeah, just kind of like that one, almost. Almost.
Yep, those are our two. Yep.
Louis, did you hear that? You gonna bark? Yeah, you gonna bark? Says no. Changed my mind. Claire, answer to your email right now, yes. Whatever it was, I know it was something about an extension. The answer is yes.
Okay, I did the assignment. I just need to put my citations in and clean it up.
Okay.
That was a very long assignment.
It was a long assignment, but did you think it was good for you as a review? It was.
Yeah,
It was
absolutely.
no, it wasn't. Good. All right, good. Other questions or concerns?
I thought you said that was due the 17th. I have to
I
just.
think it's due the 17th too.
Okay. I was like, wait, I was finished. I was gonna do mine tomorrow morning.
What the heart case study is due the
Yeah.
7th.
Yeah.
It was like on the schedule for due last night at 11:59.
Oh, real? It was?
Yeah, because
Yeah.
I thought that the case studies didn't have due dates on the.
It doesn't. It doesn't. They don't close. They're set up so they're not going to close. It was due.
The
I
test
had
was
this-
due last night.
Oh, you know what? It was on the syllabus, Claire, that it was due tomorrow to last night.
I think so. I mean, I just went to the content,
Yeah.
section, and it just said it was due with the other Wiley Lab stuff. Does that make sense?
Maybe.
I
I was like, I didn't even see a due
love
date.
your honesty.
Last week you said it was due the 17th.
Yeah. And so that, yeah.
And
it
I
was-
missed that. But anyways, I was scrambling yesterday. Well, at least it's done. I just need to
all right. Well, just, it doesn't, I didn't know that there was a posted due date except for what I probably put out in an email, which I'm debating if that went out in that email or not. I don't know. I can't
don't-
remember what I
yeah.
did a week ago.
I don't remember what I did 5 minutes ago.
You guys, you understand. All right, let's jump into today because what I want to finish blood vessels and I want to start endocrine. And we have an interesting lab. I told you guys that I got some fresh work. You saw the heart. Well, I also have lungs and we're doing lungs in lab today. So I want to make sure we have time for that. So let's get started right now. Louie, you got to bark because he's just not up for it. So. Oh, now you're gonna bark. I get it. Mhm. She said you told Louie to bark, so now I'm gonna bark. Okay. So let's start right here, arterioles. So they're the major resistance vessels. And they, through the radius of these vessels, they're going to independently supply and be adjusted depending on the body's blood demands at any given moment. And therefore they're going to equally distribute the cardiac output among the systemic organs, depending on the body's needs at that very given moment. They help regulate also arterial blood pressure. Vasodilation means an enlargement in the circumference or the radius of a vessel. And results from a relaxation of the smooth muscle, which will result in decreased resistance and increased flow through that vessel. Vasoconstriction meaning a narrowing of the vessel. So decreased blood flow through that vessel. Increased pressure, decreased flow. So vasodilation is going to lead to increased flow, decreased resistance. Vasoconstriction is going to lead to decreased flow, increased resistance. The reason we call these actually, no, I'm not going to say that. Vasomotion is defined as vasodilation or vasoconstriction, or alternating between the two. Local control of blood flow. So the arterioles are going to allow for this local control, where each tissue controls its own blood flow in proportion to whatever its needs are. Tissue needs include delivery of oxygen to the tissues, delivery of nutrients such as glucose, amino acids, and etc., removal of carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, and other metabolites from the tissues, and transport of various hormones and other substances to different tissues. This flow is closely related to the metabolic rates of tissues. So when the metabolic rates increase, arterioles in that area are going to dilate, vasodilate. When the metabolic rates slow down, those arterioles in that tissue are going to vasoconstrict. So they're going to regulate the blood flow. And the only place where arterioles do not regulate the blood flow are in the blood supply to the brain, which remains steady throughout. Changes within other organs are capable of altering the radii of arterioles in different organs or separate organs. So changes in a distant organ like the brain can alter the radii of arterioles in the stomach and adjust the blood flow from to the stomach, either vasodilating or vasoconstricting. An example, when you're resting and relaxing, parasympathetic nervous system takes over. Just had a big meal. The major part of your, or the major percentage of your cardiac output is going to your your intestinal tract, your stomach, your liver, your spleen. When you're working out, most of your cardiac output is going into your, so bear with me here, going into your muscles. And depending on which muscles are working, more blood is moving to that area. And I think I have a slide that I put at the very end, and now I'm realizing I should have put it right here, right after this. So bear with me here, because I'm going to skip down to the bottom because I know where it is. And I don't know why I put it down there and I put this slide here. Maybe not right there, here. So we haven't talked a lot about venous return. Recognize that venous return goes up as total cardiac output go, actually, no, I know why I put it down here. But what this is saying is that at rest, so much of your cardiac output is going to the muscles. 20%. 27% is going to your digestive system. 22% is going to your renal system. 14% of it is going to your cerebral part of your brain. Areas besides the blood supply. So area or major blood supply. What's a good? Oh, I'm getting myself confused. Am I? No, it says it's going up for the brain. Bear with me, that question said that it wasn't, but this looks like it is. And you can understand that if you think about it, when you're working out, if you start, there's people who get addicted to working out because endorphins are going up. And part of the reason that your endorphins are going up, or as a result of your endorphins going up, your happy hormones, your brain circulation is going up, your perfusion of your brain. It's always going to stay at 4.3 at least. But it may go up when you're working out because oh, wait, all right, I'm just getting myself really messed up here, trying to explain this figure. Let me, let's just say for right now that when you're exercising, most of your blood supply is going to your muscles. Your total cardiac output goes up drastically to easily 3 times. Remember, your total cardiac output is how much blood is your heart pumping per minute. And rather than having the majority of it at rest going to your digestive system, one of the smaller amounts is now your 3.4% is now your digestive system. So you can see that what this is doing is while the arterioles in the muscles are vasodilating, the arterioles in the digestive tissues are vasoconstricting. So based on this alone, you can see how the arterioles are regulating blood flow. When you're at heavy exercise, your renal tissues are getting 3.4%. When you're at rest, 22% of it is going to your renal system. There's a reason that very rarely when you're working out heavily, do you really need a pee? Part of that is your sympathetic nervous system, which is also regulating your cardiac output. Any questions? Made that more confusing than it needed to be. Let's come back up again. Now I remember why I put that right where I put it. So the major determinant when it comes to blood flow is the radii of the vessels. So what influences, what causes these changes in the arterial radii? Bear with me here. Get rid of this over there. So local chemical influences include local metabolic changes, muscle all of a sudden becoming actively working. When it comes to major causes of that, major dilation, there's decreased oxygen in that area and decreased local chemical changes that are coming about, meaning that are indicative of an increased need for blood. And decreased sympathetic nervous system stimulation to that area. Local physical changes on arterial radius, applying hot, heat or cold. You know, you have some of those injuries where they say alternate between using a hot heat compress and a cold compress. Because you're regulating the blood flow to that area. Local application, chemical response to shear stress. This tissue starts getting a lot redder, maybe. Not really, especially not on my arm, at least when I'm trying to do it. Myogenic response. What does myogenic mean? What does myo mean?
Muscle. So
Muscle.
genic is like originating from?
Right, right. So this is a response from the smooth muscle itself of the arterioles. So I put some air in there, but it's not very, bear with me. You can see it's not really, it's a little contracted, but it's really not there. I mean, there's a little bit of pressure in there, but not very much. So when I release it, it doesn't really, it's not going to change shape very much. Lot more stretch, a lot more pressure in there. And the result is when there's an increased pressure in the vessel, there's a much stronger need or much stronger tendency of that muscle to vasoconstrict and recoil. That's the myogenic response. I am not really great at blowing up balloons. I never have been. I was the longest time before I could actually blow one up at all. Because of my cleft lip and palate, which if you change the shape of your palate, you change your ability to blow up balloons. I learned just within the last year. I always thought it was weird that it was so hard for me and easier for everyone else. And then I learned that. But vasoconstriction, increased contraction of the circular muscle, leads to increased resistance and decreased flow. Vasodilation, decreased contraction, decreased resistance, and increased flow. If you think about that for a second, it makes sense. If I have a vessel like this, and it's got just a trickle, I've just got a trickle of it running down, trickle of water running down it. Since we know that most of blood is water, that works. And if I want to increase the pressure of that flowing water, I vasoconstrict that vessel. And the result is that the molecules of that water are much more likely to bang into the walls of the vessel if I shorten the radius of the vessel, or if I decrease the radius of the vessel. So vasodilation, make it a lot bigger radius, increased flow, decreased resistance. Vasoconstriction, increased resistance, and decreased flow. So flow of blood is inversely proportional to resistance. The greater the resistance, the lower the flow. We'll see this on a later slide, but I think repetition is not bad here. So actually, I'm going to introduce an equation right now, and then when you see it, you'll know it. So flow, and that's a terrible color. Flow is inversely proportional to resistance and proportionately regulated to pressure, or the pressure gradient from one end of the vessel to the other. Very simple equation, write it down, because we're going to see it over and over again. So myogenic response, vasoconstriction, defined as vasoconstriction in response to the stretch of blood vessels in the absence of any external factors. So this is internal, this is an intrinsic control of the arteriole itself. As you've probably observed, or maybe if you haven't, we'll bring it up now. There's some things that happen without any nervous system control. Remember that blood clotting pathway? And a student in my biology 121 class asked me, you know, what was the brain's function in that blood clotting pathway? And I said, it doesn't have one. Because what's occurring is happening with all these inherent factors that have always been there. As far as I know, it doesn't have one in there. It might be mild over time, but it's not going to have an inherent factor or in working with the blood clotting pathway. So this is another one of those, where the vasoconstriction in response to stretch is inherent within the smooth muscle of the arteriole. So increased perfusion pressure increased stretch of the arterial smooth muscle results in increased constriction, increased resistance, and then decreased flow. It's going to be a quick jump in pressure, and then it's going to go away. And you're going to be left with decreased flow. Decreased flow has a negative feedback. And then increased flow again is going to result in the same thing: increased pressure, increased stretch of the smooth muscle, increased constriction, increased resistance, results in decreased flow. Other mediators outside of the smooth muscle that are local within the endothelial cells, that they can release chemical mediators that play a key role in locally regulating arteriolar diameters. I think we can go through this chapter fairly quickly because some of this is easier to understand than a lot of what we go through. But release of chemical regulators, mediators, is going to have a control in regulating diameter. Locally acting chemical messengers in response to chemical changes. What if you increase the heat of that area or increase the temperature of that area? It's going to activate local chemical messengers within those endothelial cells. Among the best vasoactive mediators is nitric oxide. So acting chemical messenger or chemical mediator, I think it can be both ways. So functions of nitric oxide: causes relaxation of arterial smooth muscle. By means of this action, nitric oxide is going to play an important role in controlling blood flow through the tissues and in maintaining mean arterial pressure, or MAP. Sorry, not MAP, MAP. Mean arterial pressure. It's going to dilate arterioles in the penis and clitoris, thus serving as a direct mediator of erection in these reproductive organs. This erection is accomplished by a rapid engorgement, increased blood supply engorgement of these tissues with blood. It's also used as chemical warfare against bacteria and cancer cells by macrophages, large phagocytic cells of the immune system. It interferes with platelet function and blood clotting at sites of vessel damage. It serves as a novel type of neurotransmitter in the brain and elsewhere. Plays a role in changes of underlying memories, in developing memories. By promoting the relaxation of digestive tract smooth muscle, it helps regulate peristalsis. Peristalsis is the regulatory rhythmic contraction and extensioning and shortening of the digestive tract smooth muscle that pushes digestive tract contents forward. Relaxes the smooth muscle in airways of the lungs, keeping these passages open to facilitate movement of air in and out of the lungs. It modulates the filtering process in urine formation. I haven't talked about the kidneys yet, but we'll probably see it there. And directs blood flow to oxygen-starved tissues by vasodilating arterioles. So looking at, shifting gears just a little bit, looking at comparison of flow rate, velocity, and total cross-sectional area. So meaning all of the cross-sectional area of all of the arteries, the cross-sectional area of all of the arterioles combined, cross-sectional area of all of the capillaries combined, cross-sectional area of all of the venules combined. Keep that in mind when we're looking at this one. What this says is that it's comparing blood flow, cross-sectional area, anatomical distribution, and velocity of flow. In the aorta, the velocity is high, while the total cross-section area is very low. You only have one aorta. So that makes sense, right? That it would be very low. You have more arteries in general, maybe a few more. The velocity is still really high because they're fairly close to the aorta where the has the biggest pressure change or stimulus. Arterioles. Flow is dropping because we're also getting farther away, and on average it can go back and forth, right? Because some are vasodilating, some are vasoconstricting, and that's going to reduce the flow according to our diagram, or our equation that we had on the whiteboard. Total amount of capillaries, the flow goes down drastically. But the total cross-sectional area is maximized because you have capillaries everywhere. There's not a single tissue that you have. Okay, there are some single tissues that you have, but the majority of your tissues have capillaries, or they don't grow and they don't get maintained. And the anatomical distribution is throughout. The flow is down exceptionally because the resistance is much higher, meaning they're really, really tiny. And that's the reason the resistance is so low. Because when they're really, really tiny, they're going to have increased resistance. Venules, the velocity starts to go up a little bit. The flow's going up a little bit. Cross-sectional area is going down a little bit. Veins, the flow is kind of plummeting. It's dropping again. Flow is going up. And the cross-sectional area is still up. But there's also very minimal resistance. We'll see this in a little bit, but there's minimal resistance in the veins. In the vena cava, we only have a few of them, but they're huge veins. In comparison to all your other veins, they're huge. And the result is that they have decreased resistance, which allows them to have increased flow, despite the fact that the pressure changes are minimal. I know that was a lot of information. But it has to do with the fact that total cross-sectional area for capillaries is very large, but they have very small diameters, capillaries, resulting in a major increase in resistance with those vessels, resulting in decreased flow. Aorta, that's right next to the heart, has very, not a very big vessel, has relatively some resistance, but the pressure change right there, right next to the heart, is huge. And the result is that you have increased flow. But overall, on average for all of the vessels, the blood flow rate is the same. Questions? So flow velocity varies throughout. Flow velocity varies throughout, but it's inversely proportional to the total cross-sectional area of all of the vessels at any given level. So right next to the heart in systemic circulation, there's major shifts in pressure occurring. Systolic, very high, diastolic, very low, high, low. And as you move away from the heart, aorta, large arteries, smaller arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, small veins, large veins, vena cava. As you move away from the heart, the pressure changes minimize. Until you get closer to the vena cava, because there's other things that are going to increase the pressure within the vena cava. Remember, systolic pressure is pressure, blood pressure during heart contraction, ventricular contraction. Diastolic pressure is the pressure during the relaxation of the heart. So typical diameter of the aorta, 2.5 centimeters. Velocity in this area is 1,200 millimeters per second. And the arterioles, typical lumen diameter, is 20 to 50 micrometers, 10 to the minus 6. And the velocity is 15 millimeters per second. In the capillaries, we go down by about a half to a tenth in diameter, and we get very minimal velocity, 0.4 millimeters per second. In the venules, we're going up a little bit in diameter, and the result is that the velocity is also going up on average in a venule to 5 millimeters per second. In the inferior vena cava, which is a huge vessel, biggest vessel you have, well, in the superior vena cava, they're about the same. But on this chart, it's the biggest vessel you have. Because of the pressure change, because you're very far away from the heart, it's got a pretty good velocity, but it's not as big as the heart because of the pressure change. Remember that flows inversely proportional to resistance and proportional to pressure change. Please let me know if this is not clear to you. Extrinsic control of the arterioles, accomplished primarily by sympathetic nerve influence, and to a lesser extent by hormonal influence over the arterial smooth muscle. Some examples of extrinsic control. The cardiovascular control center, remember this is in the medulla oblongata of the brainstem. And the integrating center for blood pressure regulation. Other regions of the brain that influence blood distribution. The hypothalamus controls blood flow to the skin, causes you to blush or to adjust heat loss to the environment. Hormones that regulate the radius, adrenomedullary hormones like epinephrine or norepinephrine that are going to reinforce the sympathetic nervous system. You see the bear, gotta run. Hopefully you'll be faster than your friend. Vasopressin or antidiuretic hormone and angiotensin II. We'll talk about these later. We may talk about angiotensin today. I can't remember if we do or not. I think we do. But you can take a guess what that means. What do you think angiotensin means?
It has something to do with the heart.
It has something to do with the heart. The other thing that it could have something to do with is just blood vessels in general. And it's blood vessels in general. Angiotensin, angio meaning blood vessels. Angina, like what Claire is referring to, I'm guessing. Chest pain. It might work on the heart, but I don't think it does. What it does is it results in increased vasoconstriction. It also increases hormone release that results in increased water reabsorption, which is going to result in increased pressure. But wait on that because it'll come later. Just said a lot right there, and we'll talk about it later. ADH, antidiuretic hormone, what do you think that has to do with?
Absorption of water.
That's exactly what it is. So what it's going to do is that it's going to increase water uptake from the kidneys. Which of the following is associated with vasomotion? You have to remember where the smooth muscle is contained. Where do we have smooth muscle? What tunica?
Is it D?
D is in delta. I think you're right, Rachel. Everybody agree with her, she's right. Capillaries. So capillaries are thin-walled, small. Oh, and let me back up just a little bit. So remember that the tunica media, think of M as being muscle, because tunica media is where the smooth muscle is found, which is in the middle hot tunic. Externa and interna. Interna on the most internal. Tunica media, and tunica externa. And the media is in the middle and it contains the smooth muscle. So capillaries, remember, they only contain the tunica interna. But they're thin-walled, small radius, extensively branched, and sites of exchange between the blood and surrounding tissue cells. They have maximized surface area and minimized diffusion distance. Their velocity of flow through the capillaries is relatively slow because of the resistance. But you have maximized surface area for best exchange. Movement in and out of the capillaries. So you have narrow water-filled gaps that lie at the junctions between cells. Permits passage of water-soluble substances in between the capillaries and in between the endothelial cells. Lipid-soluble substances readily pass through the endothelial cells by dissolving in the lipid bilayer. The size of the pores varies from organ to organ, with two types of passive exchange: diffusion and bulk flow. Bulk flow is regulated by the net filtration pressure. If you remember that from before when we had lab several weeks ago, blood pressure is the key thing involved in net filtration pressure. But it also is going to, because it's a key factor in net filtration pressure, it's a key factor in bulk flow too. So remember, we're looking at a capillary bed. Here's the arterial end. Here's the venule end. There's a meta-arterial that moves through the center of the capillary bed. On different parts or throughout on the outer surface of the meta-arterial, throughout the capillary bed branching, there are precapillary sphincters. When they're dilated, then blood flow enters that area, that capillary bed. When they're constricted, there's no blood flow in that area. And the blood bypasses and drains directly into the venule. We have three types of capillaries. We have continuous capillaries, which are uninterrupted linings with tight junctions between the cells and limited passage of solutes. Where these are located, specifically the skin and the muscle, most common type of capillary of the three types. Fenestrated capillaries, similar to the continuous, but some of the cells have pores or fenestrations, usually found in filtration sites like the intestines and the kidneys. Sinusoidal capillaries are leaky capillaries with large fenestrations, less tight junctions, and allow for large molecules and cells to pass. They're found in the liver, the bone marrow, and some endocrine tissues. Found in areas where you want to have lots of leaky capillaries. So continuous tight junctions in between the endothelial cells. tight junctions. Fenestrated capillaries, little holes. In the endothelial cells. Excuse me. Sorry. Sinusoidal. Have big gaps in between the endothelial cells. Lined, if you look here, they're lined by cuboidal cells. Or hepatocytes in this case, liver cells. Because this, and they have lots of and you can see they have lots of microvilli on them. So, sorry. Endothelial cell. Give me a second. That one better. You guys, let's take a minute. I'll be right back. I'm gonna get something to drink and get my throat back to where it doesn't sound like it's really quiet.
Are we taking 5?
Yeah, let's take 5 right here. And let me
Sounds
get
good.
to
Thanks.
something.
Okay. It's time to leave.
Where are you out?
Nope, but he did do his business. And there's a lot more dogs out this time of day than there are.
Did you make her walk?
Oh, yes. He did take me on my walk.
Very debatable. Who's walking?
Anything at Walmart besides yogurt?
I don't think so.
Think of anything, send me a text.
Okay. Maybe a new one. Don't get dog food. Remember, I have a ton in my car. I won't. Just have to get it out of my car.
I remember that. No dog food.
I have dog toys too. Don't get any dog toys.
No dog. I don't buy dog toys. But that's really sad. I'm not feeling best so much. Oh, Jake and Daisha are going to pick up another shepherd in Missouri.
They're gonna have a whole herd.
Yeah. I
That's what,
told her when Louis goes, I may be interested in a puppy. She said she's easy to have.
okay.
And the Sable.
Another Sable, they already have one.
They got one.
When did you get the message that they were getting
She
another?
called me yesterday to see if I could come be with the kids.
Oh, they, yeah,
But I
they,
can't because it's right after my surgery and I don't think that would be smart.
they just got one. So this is another one.
Yeah, I know that Catherine got one. I didn't know it was Sable.
Okay, mother, if we get a puppy, you get to train it.
Yes, ma'am.
Because we kind of lucked out with this one.
Actually, I do. I actually know how to do that. I trained our shepherd.
Well, and it makes me crazy, so you get to do it. All right, come here, you.
She needs to feel like that.
All right, coming back. So small lipid soluble things easily pass through the endothelial cells of the capillaries. Small water soluble things will pass through the pores. Things that are a little larger but can be exchanged in vesicles will move via transcytosis. Trans meaning through, cytosis meaning cell. Plasma proteins are generally trapped within the vessel. I don't know why I'm showing this again. That must have been a typo on my part. Just remember, easily lipid soluble things easily diffuse through water-filled pores, transcytosis, things that have to be moved via vesicles. Generally, plasma proteins are trapped. Things that are able to move across the vessel and out of the vessel move according to their own concentration gradients. The concentration of oxygen will not affect the diffusion of glucose. The concentration of carbon dioxide and oxygen will not affect the diffusion of glucose. Same thing for the other two. Oxygen, concentration of oxygen will not affect, its diffusion will not be affected by the diffusion of carbon dioxide or glucose. You guys, I want to see some cameras on so I don't feel like I'm talking to myself. It's too early on a Friday morning to feel like I'm talking with myself. Thank you. Making me feel less lonely here. So net filtration pressure or net resistance pressure. And this got shrunk up, but let me give this to you another way. Bear with me here. My drawings. Want to increase my font. Can I do that? I have to think here. I don't think I can. I don't think I can. Okay, we won't worry about it. NFP, net filtration pressure. Oh, not there. net filtration pressure or net resistance pressure. Most often you're going to see it net filtration pressure. Net resistance pressure equals the hydrostatic pressure of the blood plus osmotic pressure of the surrounding tissues. So the solutes that are found in the surrounding tissues that are working to pull water into the tissues minus, guys, thank you for turning on your cameras. The hydrostatic pressure of the tissue plus osmotic pressure of the blood. So net filtration pressure equals the hydrostatic pressure of the blood plus the osmotic pressure of the tissue. Both of these are going to promote filtration. These are going to oppose filtration out of the capillary. For example, let's say that the hydrostatic pressure of the blood is, because we tend to do this in millimeters of mercury, let's say that it's 35 millimeters of mercury. The osmotic pressure of the tissue, so the tissue, the pressure of the solute in the surrounding tissues, drawing the blood into the tissues, or drawing the water into the plasma water into the tissues, is, say in this case, it's 5 millimeters of mercury. The hydrostatic pressure of the tissues equals 10 millimeters of mercury. And the osmotic pressure of the blood, depending on whether you're on the venule side or the arterial side, it's going to change. But on the arterial side, where we haven't released a lot of fluid into the tissues yet, it is 5 millimeters of mercury. So what this means is that if I plug in the numbers, when the number is a positive, it means the pressure is promoting filtration. When the overall number is negative, then the net filtration pressure is being opposed, and it's favoring absorption back into the capillaries. So 35 plus 5 minus 10 plus 5. So 40 minus 15 puts me at 25 positive. That's my net filtration pressure. So on the arterial end, this is arterial end. Arterial end of the capillary. Oh, and of course there. On the venous end of the capillary, where I've released a lot of fluid out of the tissues, assuming out of the capillaries into the tissues. On the venous end, or venule end of the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure of the blood has gone down because we've released a lot of the liquid, the fluid has moved out into the tissues. So now the hydrostatic pressure of the blood equals, let's see, 15, actually, let's not go that low. Let's say 20, yeah, let's say 25 millimeters of mercury. The osmotic pressure of the tissues is actually, it's gone down a little bit. And the reason is because as fluid is moving into the tissues, the relative concentration of the osmolarity is going to go down. So rather than have this be 5, it's now, let's say 4 millimeters of mercury. And the hydrostatic pressure of the tissues has gone up because a lot of the fluid from the blood has now entered the tissues. So the hydrostatic pressure of the tissues is, let's say, it's gone up. So let's say that it's 20 millimeters of mercury. And the osmotic pressure of the blood has gone up because all of the proteins that are trapped within the endothelial cells of the capillary, or trapped within that vessel, are now much more concentrated because a lot of the fluid has left the capillary. So the osmotic pressure of the blood equals, let's say that it's 15 millimeters of mercury. When we plug the numbers into our equation, it's like we did before, the hydrostatic pressure of the blood is 25, using the venule end here, 25 plus 4 minus 20 plus 15. So 29 minus 35 gives me a negative 6. Meaning that at the venule end, I have a net 6 millimeters of mercury that are favoring reabsorption. Fluid running back into the capillary. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, be able to plug the numbers into this equation. We're going to see it again when we talk about the kidneys. But be able
So
to, go ahead.
if it's a positive, it favors what? The negative favors reabsorption. The positive favors
What's the opposite of reabsorbing it back?
not reabsorbing.
What
I was just about to say the same thing.
let's say filtration.
There we go. Thank you.
You're welcome. So now what you want to be able to plug in those numbers. That's important. But what does that all mean? Coming into this, on the arterial end, the net filtration pressure on this end of the capillary that's next to the arterial has a net filtration pressure of a positive 10 millimeters of mercury. And like Becky was asking about, this is going to say that you're going to have positive 10 millimeters of mercury, meaning that it's favoring filtration. In the center, eventually you're going to get to a point where the two different halves of this equation, or the first and last parts, are going to equal 0. So there's no net movement of fluid one way or another. On the venous end, it's going to favor, because of the negative 7 millimeters of mercury, it's going to favor reabsorption. No, Becky, I smiled at that question, but that's a good question to ask. So both the osmotic pressure of the tissue and the hydrostatic pressure of the blood are favoring filtration. On the opposite side of the equation, or the opposing side of the equation, the osmotic pressure of the blood and the hydrostatic pressure of the tissues, is favoring reabsorption. So as the fluid moves from the arterial end to the venule end, the fluid is going to be leaving because of right here, the net filtration is favoring filtration. Net filtration pressure is favoring filtration. So lots of fluid is moving out into the tissues. Osmotic pressure of the tissues is also helping favor this movement of fluid out into the tissues, because the solute out here is pulling in the water out of the capillaries. However, we have a lot of things that are stuck in the capillaries and they're not going anywhere. So by the time we get to the other side, now the osmotic pressure in the blood is very high because whatever was trapped in there is now highly concentrated or more concentrated than it was over here. And the result is that they're going to work to bring fluid back in from the tissues. The osmotic pressure of the blood here, osmotic pressure meaning the pressure of the solutes, is going to favor bringing fluid back in. And the hydrostatic pressure of the surrounding tissues is also going to be higher because we've released a lot of water into these tissues. Remember, think of this as just your water in your hose. If you increase the pressure of the hose, you increase its filtration pressure if you had a leaky hose. A lot more of water would leak out if you increase the pressure within that hose. Questions about this? What is the most important force driving filtration at the arterial end of the capillary?
Is it E?
It's E. No, it's not.
No.
Why do you
Okay.
think it's not? Oh, wait, you said E. You
E,
said
yes.
E. Kevin, you're right. I'm so sorry.
That's all
Welcome
right.
to my brain dead moment. He's right. Do you see that? Good job. What is the most important driving force driving reabsorption at the venous end of the capillary?
C.
Yeah.
You guys are really
C.
smart. Yes, that's correct. You're really smart. I can tell you that my biology 322 students, and you guys, I'll tell you, that's how I create a lot of your stuff, because this class I've never taught before. This is my first semester teaching this part of biology 122. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the material that I'm given, that I put together for my physiology biology 322 class at Stevenson. And I use that, add it and adjust it for this course and use it for this course. And I can tell you they struggled with this question yesterday when we went over it. And so I'm impressed. You guys are smart. Veins, venous systems transport. And I'm wondering, and I will tell you, talking with some of the other professors at Hack, I wonder, and maybe I'm making this class too hard, because, or they're not giving their students enough credit. But that's just my opinion. I'm new and I'm only taught online. But a lot of them will not give you case studies yet because they don't think you can handle them. So if that comes to my detriment and someone says on an evaluation, she's really hard on us because she teaches somewhere else and they teach harder, I'll deal with it when it happens. But right now, just recognize that you're really smart. You're smart and dedicated students. The veins, venous system transports blood to the heart. The capillaries drain into the venules. The venules converge, so they merge to form small veins that exit organs. Smaller veins merge to form larger vessels. And veins, because of their large radius, offer little resistance to flow. and serve as a blood reservoir. I'm going to ask you another question. Coming back to this question, and bear with me as I do this. If someone, theoretically, this is the question that came up in my class yesterday. If someone was going into liver failure, therefore was dealing with less blood proteins, what force here would be most affected? And what would you most likely see? What force do you think would be most affected in the along of those four pressures? So they're having less blood proteins made because they're in liver failure. What pressure is being most affected here? I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to come up here to this. What pressure is most likely being affected? First,
Hydrostatic pressures?
well, let me put it another way. What is the hydrostatic pressure? What does the osmotic pressure by definition mean?
Osmosis?
And well, and what drives osmosis?
A concentration gradient from high to low?
Of solutes, right?
Yes.
So now let me ask this again. With that in mind, what pressure is most likely to be affected?
Colloid osmotic pressure?
Where, in the blood or in the tissues? Initially,
I guess in the uh,
those proteins, they don't leave the blood.
oh, so then
If overall you're having less blood tissue, less blood proteins made, what pressure is most likely being affected here?
the blood flow?
Well, no, what pressure here?
Uh,
Is it the osmotic pressure of the blood? Is it what's causing that osmotic pressure of the blood? Is it the water or the solutes within the blood?
the solutes.
It's a solute. So how in this term idea of blood proteins, what are the solutes?
In the liver?
Nope, the blood proteins anywhere.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's okay. This is a complicated question.
Very complicated. Having a
Well,
hard
don't
Oh.
think too hard about it. Are the proteins leaving the capillaries?
no.
So
mean, well-
what's happening to the, no, they're not. What's
Okay.
happening to the overall volume of the concentration of proteins if we're making less of them?
It'd be lower.
It's going to be lower. So what is that going to affect?
The tissue fluid.
Well, which pressure?
Blood pressure.
Which pressure? You're right. Which osmotic pressure?
Colloid.
Yes, but that's also osmotic. Which let me tell you what the answer is and maybe work from there. It's Claire, you were getting at it. The blood osmotic pressure. If you have less proteins in the blood, you have less osmotic pressure in the blood. And the result is that that person is most likely going to deal with edema, because remember that that's the driving force at reabsorption on the venous end. And so if he's not reabsorbing a lot of what he's putting out fluid-wise out of the capillaries, it's just staying out in the tissues. Does that make sense?
Yes.
You will not be asked that hard of a question again, but at least not in this class. We'll leave that for your next professor. You were all getting at it in different ways. Venous, so veins, venous system that transports blood to the heart. Capillaries drain into venules. Bear with me here. Capillaries drain into venules. Venules converge. Oh, we already went through that. Okay, factors which enhance venous return. So venous return, remember, that's preload into cardiac output. Another word for venous return is preload. So factors which enhance venous return. The driving pressure from cardiac contraction. How much pressure is coming at the beginning of the blood flow from the aorta to all the other vessels? Sympathetically induced venous vasoconstriction. So if we increase the blood pressure within the veins, we increase the flow, because we remember that pressure is related to flow. Directly proportional. Skeletal muscle activity. We have a skeletal muscle pump, which is going to move the blood, especially against gravity, up towards the heart. The effect of venous valves. The respiratory activity and the effect of cardiac suction. Venous valves prevent backflow. Respiratory activity works like a suction, pulling the blood towards the heart. And cardiac suction doing the same thing. So veins have normal valves. So different factors that facilitate venous return. Venous valves, pressure imparted to the blood by the cardiac contraction. How hard is the contractions? Sympathetic vasoconstriction. If you increase the venous pressure, you increase the venous flow. Skeletal muscle pump is going to increase because it's going to fight against gravity to move the blood from your feet up to your heart. allowing more blood to come from your feet. And we'll see that in a moment here. Passive bulk flow, shift of fluid from interstitial fluid into the plasma. Blood volume, increasing the blood volume, increasing the venous pressure, increasing the pressure gradient. If you increase the blood volume, you increase the pressure. The respiratory pressure, if you decrease the pressure on chest veins, you drop the pressure in the chest, well, things move from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. So if you decrease the pressure in the chest, the blood is more likely to flow towards the chest, because things always move from a high to a low pressure. So standing without any muscles contracting, the blood pressure between your feet and your heart has a difference of about 100 millimeters of mercury. When you have muscles contracting and they're pulling the blood up part way, and then the thigh muscles are pulling up the blood part way, rather than having to have all of that flow coming up of 100 millimeters and having to drive the blood flow all the way up against this pressure, now you're at 27 instead. Is that clear? So once you have the skeletal muscle pumps, or the muscles of your calves contracting, muscles of your thighs contracting, they break up that pressure, so that rather than having to fight against all 100 millimeters of mercury, you're now just fighting against 27 to bring the blood back to the heart. Questions? So fluid moving in both directions along a pressure valve in the skeletal muscle pump. The action of valves with the muscle contraction permits blood flow towards the heart, preventing backflow. So the skeletal muscles working with the valves. It's going to continue to move forward because now the pressure is higher here than it is here. So blood is going to move through because you've squeezed it right here. And it can't go back because of the valves. So it's going to continue forward because of the pressure gradient. Remember, we're just looking at water running through a hose, aka the vessel. Varicose veins. So varicose veins are caused by increased pressure in the veins. Increased pressure in the veins. The blood moves towards the heart by one-way valves. It's one-way valves that prevent backflow. when the valves become damaged, weakened, become damaged or weakened, the blood will collect in the veins because now you've got backflow and you're having to fight against the gravity. A person who stands for long periods of time, blood tends to pool in the lower limbs, and this may result in varicose veins. What causes varicose veins?
Is it B as in boy?
You're close. What else could it be, Kevin?
Mm.
That would maybe cause it, but it's not the most common cause because most often you don't have an aneurysm.
Okay.
Isn't it like
Say it again.
isn't it B as in boy?
It's not B as in boy.
C?
And
The C?
no, it's not.
Nope.
Oh, you're C. Yes, it's C. I'm so
Okay.
sorry. It's C. Here I was looking at E. Yes, it's C. B as in boy. E. Do you often have aneurysms?
No.
You probably have some, but not to the extent that they're going to cause varicose veins. Which of the following does not contribute to venous return?
I'm gonna take a guess, and I'm gonna guess C.
It's not C,
Okay.
because the pressure, if the pressure is dropping in, actually Doreen's the story. Yeah, the pressure is dropping in the atria, and that's pulling blood in. Does that make sense? Because things are moving from a high to a low pressure. What else could it be? Actually, wait, bear with me. That's the most correct answer. Oh, you know what? It's not. What would widespread vasodilation do, guys? Systemic vasodilation. If you only have 5 liters of blood, what is that going to do?
Lower your blood pressure.
And what is that going to do to your venous return?
Decrease it or increase it.
Significantly decrease it. Do you see that? Rachel, is that clear? Rachel?
Yeah.
Okay. So blood flow is constantly being reconditioned so that composition remains relatively constant. The conditioning organs receive more blood than needed for metabolic needs. Blood flow to other organs can be adjusted according to the metabolic needs. However, the brain can least tolerate a disrupted supply. So at rest, when the body's at rest, 20% of it is going to the digestive system. 6% of it's going to the liver. 20% of it's going to the kidneys, skin, 9%, brain, 13%, heart, 3%, skeletal muscle, 15%, bone, 5%, and 8% other. When the body's not at rest, a lot of it is going to the muscle when you're exercising. And all of the other percentages are having to be lessened as a result, because we only have so much blood. So at each minute, the 100% going to the lungs and 100% going from the right side of the heart to the lungs, 100% going from the left side of the heart to the other. You can say 50-50 if you wanted to go that way too. But remember that the cardiac output for the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart are the same per minute. I think I just made that a lot more confusing. Just recognize that the cardiac output on the right and left side heart are the same. And that the left side of the heart, it gets divided up. And different amount percentages will go to different regions depending on the body's needs at that moment. With the exception of the brain is always the same. So the flow rate of blood is directly proportional to that pressure gradient and inversely proportional to the resistance, which is the radius of the vessels and viscosity of the blood. So resistance of blood vessels, bear with me here. Pressure gradient is the difference between here and here. So flow is proportional to the pressure gradient. If the pressure here is 75 millimeters of mercury and it's 30 here, it's going to be relatively fast if the vessel remains the same with regards to resistance. If the pressure change here is 35 and it's 30 here, now things are going to move a lot slower. 35 here and 30 here. It's going to be fairly slow in comparison to 75 here and 15 here, if the resistance remains the same. And resistance is related to the vessel, the radius of the vessels, radii of vessel, radius of vessel, keep it singular, and the viscosity of the blood. The viscosity of the blood often doesn't change as much as the radius does. So the radius definitely has more weight and changes a lot more frequently with regards to resistance. So inversely proportional to resistance, directly proportional to pressure. Pressure gradient is the pressure difference between the beginning and the end of the vessel. Blood flows from an area of higher pressure to an area of lower pressure. Three things, and I didn't mention this before, length of resistance. Bear with me. Let me add that to our list here, since I was typing it all out here a second ago. The length of the vessel. So the major determinant, so resistance is opposes flow, and the major determinant of resistance is the vessel's radius. A slight change in the radius will result in a significant change in blood flow. Let me, actually, is that right? Bear with me here. Proportional. Oh, you know what? I think this should be an F. So flow, F. So flow is bear with me here. That looks like a typo, and it is. Pretty sure it is. Flow when we look at resistance, is R to the fourth power. The radius to the fourth. So, yeah. So relationship of flow with the pressure gradient. Increased pressure results in increased flow. The difference between 50 versus 10 or 90 versus 10. The flow in the second vessel is twice as much as it is in the first vessel. Pressure in vessel 3 is the same as pressure of the vessel 2, despite the larger absolute values. So all we're looking for is the absolute pressure change. 90 minus 10 is 80. 180 minus 100 is the same when it comes to the absolute value of it. So the fluid flow is the same, given that the resistance is staying the same. If the radius changes, the flow decreases. Because 10 ml of blood in a smaller radius is going to take up a larger length than it will in a larger vessel. So the radius of vessel 2 is twice that of vessel 1. You know, and that wasn't a typo before. I didn't have it quite right. So resistance is proportional to 1 over R4, R to the 4th, radius to the 4th. So radius of vessel 2 is twice that of vessel 1. So the resistance of vessel 2 is 1/16 of that of 1. You keep increasing the radius, the flow is going to go up because the resistance is going down. If the fluid is not bumping against the walls, the less bumping it does against the walls, the less resistance there is, right? Or what are the probabilities of a molecule here bumping against the wall a lot? What are the probabilities?
Slim.
They're pretty slim. What are the probabilities of one molecule in here bumping along the wall in comparison to here?
High.
It's higher. That's why the resistance is going up. Here. So flow rate is a function of resistance. When there's high resistance, there's no flow. When there's lower resistance, there's moderate flow. Moderate resistance, there's lower flow. When there's very low resistance, there's a large flow for the same reason as here. Which of the following would decrease the velocity of blood flow? Remember that flow is directly proportional to the change in pressure from one side of the vessel to the other, and inversely proportional to the resistance. So flow is going to go up with the pressure change and drop with resistance.
Is it A?
I think you're right. Does that sound right? Okay. Yes, that's right. Which of the following has the most important effect on blood velocity?
B.
D is in delta or B is in Bravo?
B as in Bravo.
I agree with you, yes. So blood pressure, additional reflexes and responses that influence blood pressure. So you have atrial receptors and hypothalamic osmoreceptors that affect long-term regulation of blood pressure by controlling blood volume. Chemoreceptors in the carotid and aortic arteries that are sensitive to low oxygen or high acid levels in the blood. And they're associated with certain behaviors and emotions mediated through cerebral hypothalamic activity. Exercise modifies cardiac responses. The hypothalamus is going to control skin arterioles through temperature regulation and vasoactive substances that constrict or dilate the vessels. Blood pressure is defined as the force exerted by blood against a vessel wall. It depends on the volume of blood contained within the vessel. How much blood is there? And the compliance, how much of a stretch can you get of those vessels? Systolic pressure, remember, this is the peak pressure when the heart is maximally contracted. On average is 120 millimeters of mercury. Diastolic pressure on average is 80 with the minimal pressure in the artery. Diastolic meaning the minimal pressure in the arteries when the heart is relaxed. It can be measured indirectly using a sphygmomanometer. Oh, I'm getting better at saying that word. Sphygmomanometer. And what you're measuring with the sphygmomanometer is the corticoff sounds, which are the sounds heard when you're determining someone's blood pressure. These sounds are distinct from your heart sounds that you heard with valve closure. Zoom in a little bit so we can actually read this. So when you're doing this, remember what that systolic pressure was, and I can't remember what slide it was. Bear with me here. I'm going to scroll back. I'm not there. Right here. So what we're doing when we're looking at an artery with a sphygmomanometer, we're measuring the pressure about right here, right? Because this is a large artery, or it's maybe about right here. We're looking at the brachial artery because brachial artery gravity-wise is at the same level as the heart. Coming down here. So when the cuff pressure is greater than 120 millimeters of mercury and exceeds the pressure within the vessel, there's no blood flow through the pressure. If you get it above 120, the maximal pressure, there's going to be no flow through the cuff. That's why you don't leave the cuff on there for very long. Contract it up. No, so no sound is heard because there's no blood flowing. When the cuff is between 120 and 80, blood flow through it is kind of turbulent. It starts banging. It goes. That's where you hear the first sound. And the intermediate sounds are this turbulent banging of the blood against the vessels, kind of going through a lot of resistance. When the cuff is less than 80 and below the blood pressure throughout the cycle, then it's smooth lamellar and you don't hear those. And that's the last sound, which is the minimal diastolic. So the last sound that you hear is a minimal diastolic pressure. When the blood is contracting, when the heart is contracting, you hear that turbulent as the blood is trying to squirt through that darn cuff. Once the cuff is below the diastolic pressure, you no longer hear those sounds. So the systolic pressure is the first pressure you hear, first sound you hear. The diastolic pressure is the last sound you hear. I know some of you work in the nursing field, so you're used to this and you know what it is. But that's how it's relating to the heart. So arterial blood pressure is an average, or actually arterial blood pressure is the systolic pressure is the maximal pressure of the blood when the heart contracts. Diastolic pressure is the pressure when the heart is relaxed. And you remember there was that short little diacritic notch with the aortic valve, diacritic notch. The pulse pressure, which is what you're reading with the sphygmomanometer, is the difference between the systolic and the diastolic pressure. The mean arterial pressure throughout the whole body is more weighted towards the diastolic pressure. Comparing it to your whole entire body, not just your own. So pulse pressure difference between the systolic and diastolic pressure. So if on average, the blood pressure is 120/80, the pulse pressure is 40. This is the pulse that can be felt in an artery lying close to the skin. The mean arterial pressure is the average pressure driving blood forward into the tissues throughout the cardiac cycle. The formula for approximating mean arterial pressure is the diastolic pressure plus 1/3 of the pulse pressure. So if the systolic pressure is 120 and 80 is the diastolic pressure, the mean arterial pressure is 80 plus 1/3 of 40, or 93 millimeters of mercury. Let's plug some numbers in here. So we measure someone's blood pressure. Their pulse pressure is the systolic pressure over the diastolic pressure. So let's say we measure Tiara's blood pressure. And when we measure her blood pressure, her systolic pressure is, let's say she's about 135. Oh, that was great. 135. Over 70. So what that means is that's her pulse pressure, the difference between those, which is 65. So pulse pressure is 65. Actually, this isn't quite right. This is not pulse pressure. This is just blood pressure. So take this word out right here, pulse, and make it blood. Because that's what you normally are measuring. Pulse pressure is 65 because that's actually the difference between the systolic and the diastolic is the pulse pressure. Blood pressure is systolic over diastolic. Because of time, I'm not going to try to recorrect my diagram here, but recognize that I didn't put it in there quite right. Blood pressure is systolic over diastolic. That's what you measure with the sphygmomanometer. The pulse pressure is the difference in the systolic and the diastolic. So pulse pressure is 65. The mean arterial pressure, AP, is 70 plus 1/3, 0.33 times, oh, not that one. Times 135.
Is it 135? I thought it was the difference. I thought it would have been the 65.
Am I wrong? It is an early morning. You're right. You're right. I thought it's an early morning. That didn't look right either. So 1/3, making a lot of messes with my whiteboard this morning
All good.
because I can't correct that either because, or I have to erase the whole thing. Or you know what, we're just going to erase the whole thing. Okay. Darn it, Becky, caught that one. So mean arterial pressure equals 70 plus, and like Becky said, 0.33 divided by 135.
No, 65.
You know what? This is not my morning. This is what happens when I was up really late. Okay, so welcome to my reality.
It's all good.
So 70 plus, oh, let's do this. Clear. 0.33 divided by 65 equals, well, that's really, really low.
Yeah, that's,
That isn't right.
um. I think it's, uh. Is it 0.33 times 65?
I think it is.
Because that would give you 21.45 and
I-
then add
Becky,
70.
you messed me up. Like, here I had the right answer. I was like, because I think I have it wrong on there. But I like, there's no way it's that low.
No, that was really low. It was like 0.0005.
5, yeah. All right, so I'm not gonna try to calculate it out. 32 plus 70, 92, approximately.
Yeah.
Okay, let's be done with that nightmare. So what I have is it, no, it is times. Oh, Becky, wait. I don't even have it as a typo there. Becky, you're gonna push me over the edge this morning. It's gonna be bad. You can tell she feels terrible. All right.
We did times it.
Yes, but Becky was trying to tell me it was divided initially. And then I was confusing myself. Becky, you're just lucky that I like you. All
I'll
right.
just mute myself.
Blood pressure that is monitored and regulated in the body. Primary determinants of mean arterial pressure, cardiac output, and total peripheral resistance. So mean arterial pressure, ultimately, that value that we got of 92 is determined by the cardiac output, how much blood is being pumped out of the heart per minute, plus the total peripheral resistance of all the vessels. So mean arterial pressure, that value of 92 equals the cardiac output and the total times the total peripheral resistance. So mean arterial pressure affected by the cardiac output and the total peripheral resistance. Total peripheral resistance has to do with radii of vessels and the blood viscosity. Cardiac output, remember that's a function of the heart rate plus the stroke volume. The heart rate is affected by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. The stroke volume is affected by the sympathetic and venous return. The arterial radius is controlled locally by metabolic factors and extrinsically by sympathetic nervous system activity and hormones like vasopressin. Remember, that's antidiuretic hormone. Blood viscosity is regulated by the number of red blood cells. Venous return is affected by blood volume, respiratory activity, and the skeletal muscle activity, which also affects the local metabolic control. Guys, start with this graph, start at one place and you move out from there. And then it doesn't look so overwhelming. Blood volume is regulated by blood flow fluid shifts, and salt water balance, which is affected by vasopressin antidiuretic hormone, angiotensin II, and aldosterone, which we'll talk about later, is involved in sodium reabsorption, which increases water reabsorption, which is going to increase blood volume. And these hormones are major players as extrinsic vasoconstrictors. Start at one place and move around from there. And when you do that, it's a lot less complicated. Factors that affect total peripheral resistance. If local factors, first, bear with me, I'm going to start at the top here. Total peripheral resistance. The first one, we know that ultimately it's more related to radii of vessels, but we know that blood viscosity is part of it. That's why blood doping is so bad for you, because all of a sudden you're increasing the amount of blood you have, or you're, like in Becky's case, you're polycythemic. Blood viscosity, increasing the number of red blood cells. Arterial radii is affected by local intrinsic control. The myogenic responses, remember that's the automatic vasoconstrictions in response to increased pressure. Heat and cold applications. Histamine release, remember that's really good at doing vasodilation and permeability. When we talked about that before in immune responses. And local metabolic changes in what's needed in oxygen levels and other metabolites. Extrinsically controlled by hormone, extrinsic control mechanisms, vasopressin, angiotensin II, and epinephrine. And the sympathetic nervous system. The renin-angiotensin system. So you have decreased blood pressure, your blood pressure drops. So we talked a little bit about tensin II, angiotensin II. We talked about it here, we talked about it before. Remember, it's a major factor in regulating total peripheral resistance or resistance of all vessels. What happens here is a system is often called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAS. There's decreased blood pressure. That's the initial trigger, decreased blood pressure. The kidneys put out this enzyme that acts like a hormone because it circulates throughout the blood. But they put out this enzyme called renin in response to decreased blood pressure. The liver secretes protein and this inactive, if you remember from before, when something ends in ogen, it means that it is an inactive precursor enzyme that's constantly around. So this is circulating throughout the blood all the time. But when it comes in contact with renin that's been released from the kidneys in response to decreased blood flow, angiotensinogen is converted into angiotensin I. Angiotensin I, when it circulates around in the blood some more, ends up in the lungs eventually. And in the lungs, it runs into an enzyme called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE, ACE. And ACE converts angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Angiotensin 2 has two major mechanisms of action. It induces vasoconstriction, increasing blood pressure. And it acts on the adrenal cortex to increase aldosterone levels. And aldosterone is going to result in more sodium being reabsorbed in the kidneys, which we'll talk about in a later week. That increased sodium reabsorption is going to cause the osmotic pressure within the blood to go up. And water is going to follow the sodium, increasing the blood volume. So renin is decreased blood pressure. Decreased blood pressure results in the release of renin from the kidneys. Renin, once it's released from the kidneys, circulates in the blood. And when it runs into angiotensinogen, this inactive enzyme, it's going to cleave it and produce angiotensin 1. It's going to cut the peptide and activate it, the protein. Angiotensin 1 is going to circulate, and when it enters the lungs, it's going to run into an enzyme called ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme, which is going to convert it into angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2 has two ways of increasing blood pressure. It's going to cause vasoconstriction of blood vessels, and it's going to act on the adrenal cortex to increase blood volume, or blood, which is going to increase blood pressure, by causing increased sodium reabsorption with the release of aldosterone. And the increased sodium reabsorption is going to result in more water moving in because of the increased osmotic pressure, and because water always follows sodium. Understand this pathway just this much, and we'll talk about it later again. But right now, understand it this much. Which of the following is going to decrease blood pressure?
You can't zoom out on your screen, right? Huh? You actually can.
Is it C?
No.
Is it C? It's not C, because C is actually going to cause vasoconstriction, which is going to increase blood pressure.
You press on.
Then it's
and-
aldosterone. Now that I think about it, it is aldosterone.
It's A, right?
It's actually A. D is also going to increase blood pressure.
Hey.
Which one did you say it was? I'm sorry.
It's A. It's A.
It's not B.
Actually,
I could be wrong. I don't know. I thought it was B.
it's A.
Is it okay?
I think it's A. It's either A or
I guess,
E.
yeah, because the B will be like the diuretics you will lose water, but if it's antidiuretic, you will hold on to the water, right?
Right. I think it's A. We haven't talked about the natriuretic peptides yet, but it's not E. Bear with me, guys, it will come up again. Just know right now that it's not these three, obviously, because those are the ones that are involved in increasing the blood pressure. Norepinephrine, if you remember from last semester, it's a dilator. And atrial natriuretic peptides, we'll talk about those later, but it actually is going to cause vasodilation, I think, if it's the one I'm thinking about. Where is the vasomotor center located?
B.
B is in Bravo?
Yep.
Kevin? Yep. So mean arterial pressure constantly monitored by baroreceptors. Remember, baroreceptors are pressure sensors. Stay with me for just 5 more minutes here. Baroreceptors are pressure sensors that occur within seconds, and adjustments are made by altering the cardiac output and the total peripheral resistance. It can be mediated by means of the autonomic nervous system effects on the heart, veins, and arterioles. Long-term adjustments require minutes to days and involve adjusting total blood volume by restoring normal salt, water, and water balance through mechanisms that regulate urine output and thirst. If you increase how much someone wants to drink water, you're going to increase their blood volume. If you decrease how much water they're losing through their urine, you're going to increase blood volume. So baroreceptors in the carotid sinus, when it's normal, there's a little bit of firing of the blood pressure. So here's the firing of the baroreceptors. And if you go back, you'll see where those are. Those are right where at the dividing point of the internal and external carotid arteries. So arterial pressure, firing rate arising from the carotid receptor. So when it's normal, you get a subtle firing. Maybe if the pressure drops a little bit, then that neuron fires more. As it gets higher, and gets normal, it goes somewhat there and somewhat not there. But then when the blood pressure increases drastically, then there's lots of firing. It's going to increase the heart, and it's going to increase total peripheral resistance. So overall vasoconstriction. When the blood pressure is decreased, it's very minimal firing of that neuron. So how does the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system affect the factors that influence the mean arterial pressure? Parasympathetic, heart rate goes down, cardiac output goes down, so blood pressure goes down. Remember, that's your rest and digest. Sympathetic, on the heart rate goes up, the contractility of the heart goes up, therefore the stroke volume goes up. And with the heart rate going up, the stroke volume going up, the cardiac output goes up, and the blood pressure goes up. Arterioles, increased vasoconstriction results in increased total peripheral resistance, which causes increased blood pressure. Veins, increased vasoconstriction, increased venous return. If you get increased venous return, you get increased stroke volume, which gets increased cardiac output, which gives increased blood pressure. I think we should stop right there. You guys, I want to finish this. We really have to finish blood vessels this week. So first part of lab, we're gonna finish this. And then we'll start into lab.
Okay.
Just because I know we've got to finish it. We're getting behind, really behind, and I don't want to get there. We'll be fine overall, but I've got to finish this before you guys have spring break.
Yeah, and that's next week, right? So we won't have class next week.
We won't have class next week,
Okay.
but you probably need a vacation, and so do I.
So, okay, yep, we'll finish this during lab. Sounds good.
All right, we'll see you guys in a little bit.
See you at
Thank you.
noon.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you.
bye-bye.
I just want to let you know real quick, I have
Jump, jump.
an entrance exam that I have to
You can't
take
come up this
later
way,
on
Lila.
today. It's a proctor. So
Oh,
I think it's scheduled at 2 o'clock and I might not be,
you're
Oh,
gonna miss the
Right.
lunch.
press the button.
I guess.
Darn it.
I
All right.
know.
You'll have to watch the recording later.
Okay. Yeah,
Okay.
I definitely will do that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right.
Lou or Catherine or the other Catherine, are you here?